Cyril Mervyn Maxwell was the son of Arthur Stanley Maxwell, or Uncle Arthur, the famous author of the Bible story and bedtime story sets. Mervyn, as he preferred to be called, was born on January 13, 1925, in Watford, England. The family immigrated to the United States, where Arthur edited the Signs of the Times for Pacific Press in Mountain View, California. Mervyn attended Pacific Union College from 1942 to 1946, graduating with a Bachelor of Theology degree in 1946. In 1947, he married Pauline Whites, and they would have one son, Stanley. From 1947 to 1950, Mervyn pastored a number of churches in Northern California. In 1950, he entered the Seventh-day Adventist Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C., graduating a year later with a Bachelor of Divinity degree in theology, which today would be the equivalent of a Master of Divinity degree. From 1951 to 1956, he served as a pastor in the Southeastern California Conference. Between 1956 and 1966, he studied for the PhD degree in church history at the University of Chicago, while also teaching in the religion department at Union College from 1959 to 1968. After earning his doctoral degree in 1968, he came to Andrews University, where he chaired the church history department at the Theological Seminary until his retirement in 1988. During his 40-year career as a minister and a teacher, Maxwell wrote 7 books, which sold over 700,000 copies around the world. In addition, he wrote 200 articles on Adventist history and theology for Adventist publications such as Liberty, Signs of the Times, Adventists Affirm, the Lake Union Herald, the Adventist Review, the Journal of the Adventist Theological Society, These Times, Ministry, the Journal of Adventist Education, and the Australasian Record. Maxwell's scholarship was always in the service of the church. In addition, he was active in Adventist Heritage Ministries, preserving the buildings and sites associated with Adventist pioneers. Dr. Maxwell died of lymphoma on July 21, 1999, in Berrien Springs, Michigan, at the age of 74. He was given a 4-hour funeral at Pioneer Memorial Church on the Andrews University campus. Tell It to the World is a fairly short, 271-page narrative history of the Adventist movement from 1844 to 1901 that focuses primarily on the major pioneers, mostly white men, and the watershed events, primarily theological and organizational, that shaped the Seventh-day Adventist Church, particularly in North America in the 19th century. It is intended to be an easy-to-read, popular account full of anecdotes to make history come alive for youth and young adults who already believe that the Adventist Church is God's remnant church. The publisher of this book is Pacific Press Publishing Association, a Seventh-day Adventist publisher, which in 1976 was located in Mountain View, California. Besides English, the book has been translated into Spanish, Portuguese, German, Korean, and Russian. The major thesis of the book is that the history of the Seventh-day Adventist Church reveals the workings of God's wisdom and power through thick and thin, victory and defeat, triumph and tragedy. There are, I would say, three sub-theses: that the Adventist Church exists in fulfillment of Bible prophecies given 2,000 years ago. Second, that through the struggles and conflicts, the Adventist Church has grown bigger and stronger, and that we can see God's hand working providentially in the lives of the Adventist pioneers. The type of history, it's basically an anecdote-based narrative history written primarily for Adventist believers. As such, the author has adopted an apologetic tone in which he sees every event, good or bad, as eventually fulfilling God's purpose to strengthen the Advent movement over the long run. Although Maxwell's book is more accurate regarding factual information, things like names, dates, places, events, and so forth, and it has the benefit of hindsight and reflection, being written a century or more after the events that it records, it essentially follows the same narrative, anecdotal, apologetic paths forged by previous comprehensive Adventist history books. And so let us look at some of those comprehensive histories published prior to 1976. The first would be John Norton Loughborough's book, The Rise and Progress of the Seventh-day Adventists. It was published in 1892. It is a 392-page volume that was largely apologetic, narrative, anecdotal history read by Adventists, and more specifically by academy and college students and missionary volunteers. Loughborough's The Great Second Advent Movement, which was published in 1905, is a 480-page textbook that also is apologetic in tone, narrative, anecdotal history, read largely by Adventists, and more specifically by academy and college students and missionary volunteers who were required to pass examinations on its content over the next half century. The next book is Malin E. Olson's A History of the Origin and Progress of Seventh-day Adventists, which was published in 1925. As you can see, it is a rather huge 768-page apologetic, narrative, anecdotal history read primarily by Adventists, academy and college students, and missionary volunteers. A decade later, Emma Howell Cooper published The Great Advent Movement in 1935. This is, as you can see, a much shorter 256-page history that begins with a 40-page overview of the Millerite and early Advent movement of the 1840s and 50s, and then focuses primarily on the North American Division and General Conference administrative departments, with brief sketches of overseas missions. The General Conference Department of Education in 1956 produced The Story of Our Church, a 580-page textbook for academy-level students with 7 units and 68 chapters full of facts, inspiring stories, photos, maps, and chapter review questions. Although it is less anecdotal than the previous histories, it is equally apologetic. Arthur Spaulding's Origin and History of Seventh-day Adventists, published in 1961 and 62, is a 4-volume, 1,600-page history of the Adventist movement, and this is just volume 1, some 500 pages. It is far more detailed than any previous histories, with depth and breadth of facts and interpretations, statistics, graphs, biographical sketches, theological controversies, and overseas mission work. And yet it is still somewhat apologetic in tone. As for this book, its strengths and weaknesses, all of the Maxwell men for 3 generations, Arthur Maxwell, his sons Mervyn and Lawrence, his grandson Stanley, have had a knack for telling fascinating stories and reconstructing creative dialogue in their books. And so, as one would expect, Maxwell's writing style is engaging, personal, enthusiastic, and somewhat detailed. He also brings the old Millerite and Adventist pioneers to life with apt descriptions, anecdotes, narratives of their struggles, challenges, triumphs, and tragedies. This makes for easy reading prose all the way through the book. However, Adventist scholars and historians have been quick to point out the following weaknesses in Maxwell's book. First, it places too much emphasis on anecdotes and recreated dialogue, which is creative prose but not scholarly writing. Second, it lacks analytical balance and critical depth on the key issues and events in Adventist history. Thirdly, it ignores the contributions of African Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans, Latino Americans, and the individuals who apostatized from the church, but who made significant contributions nonetheless. Examples would be Louis R. Conradi, Dudley M. Canwright, John Harvey Kellogg, and several others. Fourthly, while Maxwell briefly mentions a dozen women, he crowds them all together into one chapter entitled Leading Ladies, without providing proper historical context throughout the narrative. Fifth, the book does have endnotes, but it lacks a bibliography. And finally, there is simply no coverage of the 20th century church after the Reorganization General Conference of 1901, which means essentially there is a total gap of 75 years from 1901 to 1976. As to the impact of the book, Tell It to the World largely impacted Seventh-day Adventist believers, young people, academy-level teenagers, and some young adults. It had little impact on non-Adventists, academics, and Adventist historians and scholars who already knew its stories and were seeking something more scholarly, critical, balanced, and analytical in nature. As to why Elder Maxwell wrote this book, back in the 1970s, Elder Maxwell fully expected that his book would replace Spaulding's 4-volume history and become the standard textbook in all Adventist colleges worldwide. But this never happened, principally because Dr. Richard Swartz, with the assistance of graduate student Brian Strayer, had already been chosen by the General Conference to write the textbook Light Bearers to the Remnant, which was published 3 years later in 1979 as the college-level textbook on denominational history. This book is far more detailed, factual, analytical, and comprehensive. It covers the rise of Adventism around the world from the 18th century into the 1970s, and includes the stories and contributions of white, black, Asian, Latino, and Native American men and women. Although Maxwell's book sold very well at camp meetings, youth rallies, and ABCs, and was widely read by young people and Adventist believers who enjoyed its narrative style, it received rather mixed reviews. Its most positive reviews, as one might expect, appeared in the mainline denominational publications. One example was Russell Holt's review in Ministry magazine for July of 1978. Holt praised the book, saying that it reflected Maxwell's inimitable style as a master storyteller who combined lots of facts and stories in a very readable, consistently interesting, yet highly probing analysis of how Adventism began. Holt called the book profitable reading. A more nuanced review was written by Alice Gregg, a Loma Linda University librarian, for the Adventist Heritage Journal in the winter of 1977, Volume 4, Number 2. She labeled the book a popular history and an apologetic history, but she called it the most readable of all Adventist church history books yet produced. On the positive side, she praised Maxwell for his style that never bogs down in the trivia of the past, for his thorough coverage of the leading landmarks, particularly in 1844, 1860, 1863, 1888, and 1901, and for putting Christ, not Ellen White, at the center of Adventist beliefs and activities. However, Howell faults him for not dealing with the unfortunate afterlives of Canright, Jones, and Wagner after 1888, for devoting little space to the health message, the education work, and the vast global outreach of the church after 1874. Ending on a positive note, however, Gregg, anticipating that Maxwell would probably write another volume covering the 20th century, asserts that that would be something to look forward to. However, Maxwell never wrote such a sequel. Adventist scholars and historians generally gave the book negative reviews because they found it lacking in objectivity and analytical depth and sketchy in scope since it stopped at 1901, completely ignoring the significant people, places, events, and controversies of the 20th century church. Dr. Benjamin MacArthur's review for Spectrum in June of 1982, Volume 12, Number 4, described it as a believer's history that constituted a collection of stories and anecdotes with theological digressions on doctrines, which hopes to inspire readers to devotion to the third angel's message. He also decried its irritating sentimentality, its informal conversational style, and its depiction of Ellen White as a divine troubleshooter who was an icon, who stood above history and was without faults. He concluded that the book added little to our knowledge of Seventh-day Adventist history. As to its theological, social, political biases, given the fact that C. Mervyn Maxwell was a white male whose parents had emigrated from England, it should come as no surprise that his narrative history primarily focuses on the pioneers who themselves were white males of European ancestry. Rarely does one find any mention of a significant African American, Native American, Asian, or Latino Adventist. And in the main, white Anglo-Saxon women play a very minor role in this narrative, while women of color play no roles at all, except for Anna Knight. Likewise, theological and doctrinal positions which clashed with present truth and therefore did not prevail over the long run are also given short shrift. such teachings as the shut door, the keeping of Sabbath from 6 p.m. Friday to 6 p.m. Saturday, and Hiram Edson's highly unusual and very strange prophetic views. Is the book still worth reading? I think the book is worth reading for the following three groups. First, teenagers and young adults who need anecdotes and stories to keep their interest. Second, new Adventists who lack a basic knowledge of the important individuals and events of our 19th century history. And third, individuals who are seeking an inspirational, devotional, upbeat narrative of the Adventist past. On the other hand, church members seeking a more scholarly treatment of Adventist history should read Richard Schwartz and Floyd Greenleaf's textbook, Light Bearers, and the 13 volumes of the Adventist Pioneer Biography series. They would also be advised to read other books and articles by Adventist scholars, such as Terry Amont, Kevin Burton, Michael Campbell, Everett Dick, Floyd Greenleaf, George Knight, Gary Land, Benjamin MacArthur, Douglas Morgan, Richard Schwartz, Brian Strayer, Walter Utt, and Gilbert Valentine.